even think to go into these novels? You mentioned Nathaniel Hawthorne. You mentioned Washington Irving. You were bringing out these stories of how our understanding of masculinity has been shaped by these American authors. What made you go in that direction to help understand this idea of masculinity?
Well, you have probably noticed that most of my books have mostly secular sources.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I noticed that. And you have a lot of them, you have a wide variety of secular sources in there. I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, it's the most data-driven book that I've written, by the way, because you have the sociological data that we just talked about, and then we have all this historical data. And so right now there are libraries full of books on the history of women because of feminism. I found about 3 books on the history of men. So, it was only a couple of books out there. They were very good. And then you'll have a couple of books like on the history of fatherhood and so on, most isolated topics. But this information is out there. It's just that Christians aren't reading these books. And that's another reason I wrote the book, is to bring this information to the Christian world. But let me, I go through several stages in the secular definition of masculinity. And let me pinpoint just one of them because it's so influential, and that was the rise of Darwinism.
Yes,
Darwinian
social
evolution.
Darwinism, right? Yeah, you mentioned that.
Because social Darwinism, basically, they said the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be the men who were tough, egotistical, brutal, predatory, savage, barbarian. And so these are our ancestors, of our modern men. And therefore, this is our true nature, was what the message was, that the beast within is your true self. And all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had said, wait a minute, our animal impulses should be controlled by the higher faculties of spirit and moral will. And now that was flipped. And people began to say, no, your animal nature is your true nature. And it's covered by a thin veneer of civilization. That was one of their favorite phrases. It's just a thin veneer, and the true self is the uncivilized barbarian within. And this had an incredible impact, very negative impact, as you can imagine, on the secular definition, therefore, of manhood, that, this is our true nature. And you ask, well, how did women get along with such brutal men? And their answer was, this is Herbert Spencer, who was the major popularizer of Darwinism here in America. Spencer answers and says, well, women had to develop the ability to please. And then he added, it would also help if they learned how to hide their displeasure at such bad treatment. So this was the message of evolution. And then Darwin himself explicitly argued that women were inferior, mentally and socially and intellectually. And he said, he acknowledged that women were more sensitive, intuitive, but then he said, those are the traits of the lower species. So even women's positive traits were signs of their inferiority. And Thomas Huxley, who was, Darwin's bulldog, quote unquote, he had that moniker, argued that because women's inferiority is a product of natural selection, there's no way to overcome it, even with educational selection. In other words, we can't educate her to a higher level. So the impact of Darwinism was a huge part of developing a very negative secular script for masculinity.